To start our investigation of Dylan's With God on Our Side, we first need to start with this man here. This is Irish balladeer Dominic Behan, sorry if I'm mispronouncing his last name, and we definitely would not have With God on Our Side, the third song from the Times They Are Changin' album, without this man, because he wrote a song called The Patriot Game. It tells the real-life story of an attack by the IRA on an Ulster Constabulary barracks in 1957, and it tells it from the point of view of one of the IRA members who dies. And so it comes out of the Troubles, as they're called. It's one of the most famous and influential songs to come out of the Irish nationalist side, and yet it has a very jaded view of things. Our hero is caught up in the Patriot Game and loses his life because of it. Just look at the first couplet. Come all you young rebels and list while I sing. For love of one's land is a terrible thing. It's a great song in its own right. I mean, no question about it. It's got some lines that will hit you like a right cross. So it deep dives on the Troubles and the protagonist's perspective on everything. It's kind of an ambivalent song. At heart, the message is the story. It's not preaching that he should never have gotten involved in this. Despite those opening lines I read to you, it's not a denunciation of violence. It could even be read as endorsing it at times. For instance, this couplet. I don't mind a bit if I shoot down police. They are lackeys of war, never guardians of peace. But it does clearly have a recurring theme where patriotism, nationalism, being told about your country's war heroes, who you're supposed to hate because they're your country's enemies, how all of that can lead to an untimely end for someone who buys into it. But now let's move on to Bob Dylan, who did something very different and yet very similar. Dominic Behan was not happy at all with this song. He thought it was almost a parody of his. One particular accusation was that Dylan stole the tune, and that's very odd because Dominic Behan used a previous tune from a folk song called The Merry Month of May when he wrote Patriot Game. But anyway, thematically, he's definitely right. Dylan, especially young Dylan, would often take an existing song, and that would be the starting point, but more like a departure point. Not so much here. Here he was clearly inspired by the original. What he essentially did here in transforming the song into his is he took a song that was a microcosm and made it a macrocosm. So one person's a story in this very traditional folk ballad kind of a way. This one person's a sad story about how he got, roped into this conflict and now is going to die. Dylan broadens that up to a global historical perspective, and how the Patriot Game exists in all countries and has existed in all countries and all times and led to countless deaths, not just one person's. Now, he uses United States history as the lens with which to do that, but the message is clearly global. Furthermore, he focuses on something with laser intensity on something that is entirely missing from the original. And that is the belief that God is behind your country, your people, your side in the conflict. Obviously, the irony being that everybody on every side believes that. And that doesn't just happen in ancient history, say with the Crusades or the many, many religious wars that have taken place in Europe. Here's a quotation from President George W. Bush to Bob Woodward. Quote, I was praying for strength to do the Lord's will, end quote. That's in relation to the Iraq War. Meanwhile, what does every anti-U.S. insurgent terrorist, whatever term you want to use, what do they believe about a certain deity being on their side? And it continues, here's a very recent president holding the Bible in a photo op, the message being clear, I'm on God's side, which is the same as saying God is on our side. You can go even further when you find fan art like this, and this is, by the way, a real thing. You can buy a copy on Amazon if you like. Now let's get to the actual song, but to do that we have to start with Patriot Game yet again, because in that song the narrator early on tells you his name, age, and in what part of Ireland he was brought up. Dylan very purposefully goes in the opposite direction. His song starts, Oh my name it is nothing, my age it means less, the country I come from is called the Midwest. And I think it's unfortunate but understandable where Behan could feel like that was somehow almost mocking his song. Anyway, to continue, I's taught and brought up there the laws to abide, and that the land that I live in has God on its side. So here's young Bob Dylan, baby boomer, being brought up in the Midwest in the Iron Range, where this picture is from. This is either Duluth or Hibbing, I can't remember. dutifully accepts what I dutifully accepted when I was being brought up decades later, that this is God's country. Specifically Christian, of course, and speaking of that, Christ gives a good example for what Dylan does next, which is, let's look at ourselves. So let's look at the beam in our own eyes. And he spends a good amount of time, 7 minutes, it's a long song, 9 stanzas, 343 words, uses all that to examine this concept. And he does that by tracing the history of several American conflicts, in chronological order with one exception. Second stanza. Oh, the history books tell it, they tell it so well. The cavalry's charged, the Indians fell. The cavalry's charged, the Indians died. Oh, the country was young, with God on its side. So the nation, this land of God, is just getting started, and a genocide is already on the table. Very economical wording in this entire song, very direct, as the entire song is direct. Certainly not the case with all of his works, right? Got some great wordplay, of course. Oh, the history books tell it, they tell it so well. The cavalry's charged, the Indians fell. So if you notice, that L sound appears 4 times in just those few lines. They tell it so well, the cavalry's charged, the Indians fell. Well and fell are juxtaposed, and that's interesting because well can also be taken to mean good, but it's juxtaposed with fell, as in the Indians dying. One thing I'd like to add to the conversation about this song that I haven't seen anywhere else is that we cannot overstate how overriding the mythos was of cowboys versus Indians for kids of Dylan's generation, and many others. So this isn't just some obscure note about history. This is a game you would play as a kid. I remember playing this as a kid in the 70s and 80s. And really think about this. Generation after generation is playfully recreating the conquest of an indigenous people. And I'm not saying this was consciously organized as a indoctrination exercise or anything like that, propaganda at all. It wasn't. It's a very organic thing. But if you step back, so which was the God side and which was the heathen side in that conflict? And then add the idea of manifest destiny. God means for us to take over all of this land. So in the game, young innocent kids are recreating murderous campaigns. And of course, both sides committed atrocities, but, that's besides the point. Here's a very young Bob Dylan, by the way, and in this stanza, he makes that association with youth and innocence. The country was young, as he sings, and I wonder if he was consciously thinking about the game of cowboys and Indians when he wrote that line. Next stanza. Oh, the Spanish-American War had its day, and the Civil War, too, was soon laid away. And the names of the heroes eyes made to memorize, with guns in their hands and God on their side. The Spanish-American War is, a minor conflict in our history, but it's great that Dylan included it. Here's a nice racist caricature, right, of a Spanish person. You always want to dehumanize the enemy so it'll be easier to kill them. But this is really prophetic here. The Spanish-American War was based on misinformation, the riling up of the people's passion through lies, tricking them into wanting to fight an unnecessary war. Wow, that happens a few more times throughout our history. The Civil War, on the other hand, is the bloodiest war we ever fought, and it's one we fought just with ourselves. But even when it's all the people within one country and basically one God, each side claims God is with them. Real quick on a phonetic note, notice it's not I was made to memorize eyes. Why? Because it rhymes with memorize. Eyes made to memorize. The symmetrical line. It's not alliteration, and it's not rhyming as in the end of lines. Anyway, made to memorize, with guns in their hands and God on their side. That last couplet is just exquisite. Moving on, oh, the First World War, boys, it closed out its fate. The reason for fighting I never got straight. But I learned to accept it with pride, for you don't count the dead when God's on your side. With simple and very direct lyrics, Dylan effortlessly exposes the ludicrous nature of World War I. That event probably represents the most senseless waste of human life in our entire history. The roots are so Byzantine and bizarre. But Dylan is taught that if you're going to be a good citizen, don't worry about it, just be proud. Now the gloves really come off. When the Second World War came to an end, we forgave the Germans, and then we were friends. Though they murdered 6 million in the ovens they fried, the Germans now too have God on their side. I think it's fair to be critical of Dylan for being so unsparing of an entire country, which, was being led by a homicidal regime. Keep in mind how raw this wound was. Dylan is Jewish and was raised in the 1950s, so in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. Dylan is partly pointing out here that even in a quote-unquote just war, unjust things happen. And as part of, allying against the looming threat of communism, how many Nazis, not just regular Germans, but actual Nazis, went unpunished for this atrocity? Well, the answer is most of them. And on that cheery note, realize that as a songwriter, Dylan has now caught up to the present. This song was recorded in 1963, so World War II was the last big conflict. Vietnam hadn't started up yet, not in earnest at all. Nobody thought that was going to be our next big war. Everybody, Dylan included, reasonably assumed the next big conflict was going to be with Russia and the communist regimes. Let's do the next two stanzas in conjunction because they're about the same subject. I've learned to hate Russians all through my whole life. If another war starts, it's them we must fight. To hate them and fear them, to run and to hide, and accept it all bravely, with God on my side. But now we got weapons of chemical dust. If fire them we're forced to, then fire them we must. One push of the button and a shot the world wide. And you never ask questions when God's on your side. Yes, Dylan is being imprecise when he uses the phrase chemical dust to describe the atomic bomb, even though that's obviously the worldwide threat that he's referring to. But it gave him a great rhyme. If fire them we're forced to, then fire them we must. He was also imprecise, by the way, when he name-checked the Spanish-American War before the Civil War. Anyway, back to the Cold War. Dylan is correct in pointing out that at this point war has quote-unquote advanced to the point where all of humanity is at risk. He and his schoolmates had to participate in bombing drills, practicing for the dropping of bombs on them by a country that resides literally on the other side of the planet. He's seeing advertisements for fallout shelters. That's all part of the running and hiding, and he's correct here in what he's pointing out, it's so counterintuitive, living in fear bravely, to run and to hide, and accept it all bravely with God on my side. That contradiction is a good description of the surreal nature of the times. And despite the overwhelming devastation these new kinds of weapons can unleash, we'll fire them if we must. Wonderful line, kind of really sardonic, I think, is what his intention was. Did we have to drop the atomic bomb, much less two, to end World War II? And remember, these two stanzas end with the lines, and you never ask questions when God's on your side. So, any thinking, feeling human being would have to conclude it's at least an open question whether or not this here was necessary. And is God really on your side when you erase two entire cities full of civilians from the map? The song then has cleverly built its case layer by layer, built it up to the point of, if God was on our side when we massacred Native Americans, when we did this, when we did that, all the way up to the point of God's on our side if we go into a global nuclear war. And by the way, I'm not saying, and I don't think Dylan was saying either, that America is always the bad guy, that there aren't things to be proud of in our history, including our war history. I think it's wonderful that the United States defeated a confederacy that was basically trying to establish a slaveocracy. And, obviously I know that wasn't the reason the North fought, but I still think it's great that happened. I think it's great that the United States of America was critical in defeating the Nazis. And Dylan in songs and elsewhere has glorified some of our military heroes. But Dylan is doing something more challenging than patting ourselves on the back for the things we did well, right? Let's look at our faults. And, is America a place that's particularly prone to falling to the Patriot Game trap? Well, maybe. We are, after all, the only nation that has this exceptionalism, explicit belief. Like, we are special amongst all other nations in the entire world. And if you believe that, that's not very far from believing you're divinely inspired in whatever it is you do. And speaking of the divine, and speaking of thinking God is on our side continually, what about God? What about Jesus? Next stanza. Through many dark hour, I've been thinking about this, that Jesus Christ was betrayed by a kiss. But I can't think for you, you'll have to decide whether Judas Iscariot had God on his side. This, by the way, here is a ancient, not modern, painting of Judas. It's definitely worth noting that the listener is directly addressed for the first time. You'll have to decide. I talked about how the song broadens on the original, on its inspiration. Instead of nationalism leading one person to throw their life away, like in the Patriot Game, this kind of a thing, especially when you work in this belief in divine backing, can lead to the entire world throwing its life away via nuclear Armageddon. And unlike Dominic Behen's song, this one deals with how believing in that divine backing can lead to atrocities. We're looking at an image about the Inquisition, torture visited upon countless people. That was in Spain, and it was done for country and God, not just either or. It's the exact nexus that Dylan is highlighting. Think about the Crusades, which were, of course, sold as a holy war. And any student of history knows it was a little bit more complicated than that in reality. And back to the stanza about Judas, the song is moved up even further to where now the narrator's considering, well, if I do believe that God sanctions everything we do, my people do, doesn't that mean he sanctions everything by default? So the greater implications of taking for granted God as an active agent in this world come into play. If God is always on our side, how come we lose sometimes? Did God mean for us to effectively lose in Vietnam? To the godless communists, no less, of North Vietnam, did God mean for the United States to abandon the people of Afghanistan to the Taliban? And aren't the Taliban at this very moment saying, see, we knew God was with us. We eventually won, at least in the fact that they were able to take over the country. The complexities just keep going and going the more you think about it, and the more you think about it, the more insane the idea seems that God takes side in war, especially since you can't fight a war without killing innocent people. And why haven't people woken up to this racket? Especially since, as Dylan illustrates in the song, war keeps getting deadlier and deadlier to the point where it now threatens the entire species. Well, no wonder Dylan ends the song with, so now as I'm leaving, I'm weary as hell. The confusion I'm feeling, ain't no tongue can tell. The words fill my head and fall to the floor. If God's on our side, he'll stop the next war. And it's pretty obvious, I hope, how this song is not just brilliant, but constantly relevant, and unfortunately so. Remember that this song was written before the Vietnam War was really a thing for the US. And yet the great Ken Burns found it appropriate to use it multiple times in his documentary about that war. But of course that relevance extends to today. So much of the violence, traditional war or untraditional asymmetrical warfare, terrorism, that the world is dealing with as we speak. Speaking of as we speak, here is sadly a picture from Ukraine. Russia decided to invade Ukraine right as I was editing this video. And Vladimir Putin has justified his invasion in very nationalistic terms. Also, he's motivated by a very manifest destiny-like belief himself in that he thinks Russia is, meant to control the surrounding countries. These Ukrainians here are fleeing the coming violence, a violence issued under the mantle of belief in the justness of what you're doing, the belief that it must be okay because it's being done for your country. So the Patriot Game continues, the racket continues, and how many more will die because of it? And how many more atrocities, overt war and non-overt, will happen because of it? A final note, just a little coda here. This is the only Dylan song, the only one where I clearly remember first hearing it, the experience of hearing it for the first time. And I wouldn't even rate it as one of his top-tier songs, but obviously it was strong enough to make that impression on me. Thanks for watching.